Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure to have you. This is my part 3 in the book that I'm reading for you, which is the Muslim Spains and Portugals. We left off with the theoretical rape of King Rodrigo's rape of the Byzantine garrison commander's daughter, and his call for the Moors to join him. There's more into this than what I've actually led on. I have had my own historical information brought along involving where there was another reason why the Moors may or may not have landed. First and foremost was the rumour, and I completely stand up and hold my hand, rumour, that the Moorish people pre-Islam and the Visigoths, which were pre-Christian at the time, there were conflicts across the waterways at all times. So the early Moroccans, to say. And it is rumoured that the early Moroccans had their children being snatched by the southern pagan Visigoths, with a very small garrison of Romans at the time, acting upon cannibalism. And the Romans allowing them to get away with it, because it kept the barbarian North Africans away. So again, there are multiple rumoured reasons to why the Moor invasion was. There is an entirely plausible reason that the Moors came north to spread Islam and to conquer the Iberian Peninsula. That is an entirely valid historical point of view. But the evidence in these positions, as we've discussed and as I've proven, have not exactly gone too far. So, with the like some other Muslim conquests, Al-Andalus expedition to Egypt, for example, the invasion of Spain seemed to have been undertaken on a local initiative without the approval of the hierarchy. Now, this is entirely true, and again, it was more to do with the local garrisons inside of Morocco, what would futuristically be Morocco, which was actually under the command of the Tripoli governor, than it was actually an act from the Umayyads back in the Egyptian area to start with. Seem to have been undertaken on a local initiative without the approval of the hierarchy represented in the case of the governor of Ifriq at Qalem, Musa by Nasaras, and ultimately the Caliph al-Wayed al-Malik in Damascus. Majority opinion holds that Tarquin ibn Zurak, the governor of Tangier, with a force of perhaps 7,000 to 12,000 men, mostly Bebians, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in April 7 to 11 and established themselves first on the rock which still bears Tarquin's name, Gibraltar, before moving on to occupy Algeciras and the surrounding countryside. Opinions differ as to whether they encountered any immediate resistance. Now, from my own background research capacity, yes, they did. But most of it was banditry. Visigoth banditry was very serious in this time period. So the resistance they were meeting were not Visigoth royalists, they were Visigoth criminals, because this part of Andalusia at that time period was not heavily densely populated, consisted of a lot of criminals, bandits, and other ne'er-do-wells in the south. Opinions differ as to whether the encounters immediate resistance, but are agreed that Rodrigo and the bulk of the Visigoth army were camping in the north of the country, and it was not until the summer that he was able to lead his army south to counter the invasion. This is where he came from the north of what was the Visigoth kingdom, which wasn't all of Spain at that point. You've got to remember the Visigoth kingdom only went as far as Toledo, which is, I think, about middle Spain. There followed the battle which to determine the future of Iberian Peninsula for the next 8th century. It seems to have lasted for a number of days, and around the 20th of July 711, the exact site of the battlefield has been the subject of prolonged debate, but it is probably laid in the southeast of Mendocinos. Again, we don't know, because the historical evidence of much of the weaponry of that lot, because at the time the Bebians were well known for stripping the dead, especially combat dead. They would bury the bodies, but the armour, equipment of that lot, which would have survived in the graves if they'd just been buried in the Christian terminology of warfare Christianity. Unfortunately, the Bebians would take the steel to remake it, because steel was very valuable, metal was. The sources give very large numbers for Rodrigo's Zone, between 40 to 100,000, and whilst these are certainly exaggerated, it is likely that Rodrigo's Zone was significantly larger than Tarquin's. Actually, the Rodrigan army we now know is more along the lines of 20 to 22 to 24,000, so it was very well established, but they were lots and lots of infighting going on between the nobilities under the king. The king and his nobles didn't get on with each other. The nobles couldn't stand him, even the ones that did support him for the war and honoured their agreements. So there was a lot of infighting. Morale wasn't huge. Whereas, on the other hand, the Muslim army was extremely disciplined at this time period. Everyone knew their roles. There was no massive infighting. So it was significant. Arab sources suggested that there were divisions in the Visigoth ranks, and that the brothers of Witzers at least hoped that the Muslim would defeat Rodrigo and then depart, leaving them to assume the crown they felt was rightly theirs. Whatever the reasons, the Visigoth army suffered a shattering defeat. Rodrigo was missing, presumed dead, and members of the army scattered throughout the Iberia, spreading defeatist sentiments. This isn't defeatist sentiments. The 7,000 Moran troops landed and attacked with such force, precision, and accuracy that their numbers allowed them to take out sections of Rodrigo's army bit by bit. So the survivors had defeatism, because if you're 7,000 facing 4-1 odds, which they were, you have to realise that they're against 4-1 odds, but these 4-1 odds weren't simultaneously. They weren't facing Rodrigo's army in one go. Rodrigo was putting down rebels amongst his own nobles. We believe he executed 2 of his own noble officers, whilst his army is being attacked by a military that is drilled, disciplined, and all working together. Tarquus moved with speed and confidence, aided by Count Julian. He dispatched a force under Murger and Elbrus to Cordoba. Here Murger encountered serious resistance from the governor and a small garrison who defended themselves in a church after the Muslims had entered the city through a hole in the wall. It was 3 months before they surrendered and were executed. Mulger and the district of Elvius, the area around the late city of Granada, which did not really become important until the 11th century, seemed to have been taken by small units without much trouble. But Tarq himself moved on quickly to the Visigoth capital of Tolero. There was no resistance. Most of the people, apart from the Jews, had abandoned the city, and Tarquin was able to spend the winter of 7 to 11 to 12 there. Tarquin's speculated success attracted the attention of his superiors, Musa ibn Nirasus in question, and he was understandably eager to associate himself and his supporters with the triumph and the booty which went with it. The next year he set out with a large force, 18,000 men, who we are told, which included many Arabs. He landed at Algeciras and adopted a strategy which would enable him and his men to make conquest of their own. He went first to the great fortress of Caramoria, which had been bypassed by Tarquin, which was captured with the help of some Count Julian's men who pretended to be fugitives, and so gained access to the city. This is a critical point. The Byzantines were so fucked off with the Visigoths, I apologise for swearing, ladies and gentlemen, that they were acting as allies to the Muslim conquerors. Literally. It was like the Byzantine Christians and the Muslims were working hand in hand because of the way the Visigoth kings and the Catholic faith treated them. Where were we? He then went on to take Seville, which is said to have resisted for several months before being taken by force. We are given no more details about the siege, and it may be that the resistance was invented so that the city could be said to have been taken by storm and its lands confiscated. This is a very dubious point of view, and I have to defend the Christian chronicles in this regard because there is no evidence of their resistance in any kind of fragments of the Islamic scholarships that have been translated in English that I've read of them. So the evidence of the seizure is immoral. So the seizure of Seville was probably against the Quranic rules on war, which is said to have resisted some months before being taken by force. We are given no more details about this siege, and as I've said before, the Moors subdued the neighbouring towns and went on to north to Merda, where the Arab chronicles commented on the splendour of the Roman remains. Here there was serious resistance. The garrison made a sortie, and siege engines were required to force it into submission in July 713. Whilst this was going on, Musa sent his son Abdul al-Azir to the east, where he came to Orython, there the most important city in Murica. The city of Murica itself was another later foundation district. He was met by the local commander of Duax Themodormia, with whom he made a treaty whose lenient terms meant effective local autonomy and freedom of Christian worship in exchange for goodwill and a modest tribute paid in cash. Wheat, barley, thickery, grape juice, vineyards, honey and oil. As a result of this, the Murica area was known to the Arabs as Tudmir for centuries afterwards. After the fall of Merida, Musa headed for Toledo, where Tarquin came to meet him. Inevitably, when the two forces did join at Talvin, there were tensions and reproaches, but they patched up their relationship and wintered together in Toledo. In the spring of 714, campaigning began again with expeditions which led to the normal subjugation of Galicia and the Eberon Valley. Their triumphs was brought to a halt by a summons to present themselves before the Caliph in Damascus. This is serious because remember how rich Andalusica was, and in Islamic scholarships back home, they knew how rich old Andalusica was under Roman times. So the Caliph's like, hang on, I'm not getting none of this action. Alhamdulillah, I want to be seeing some of you boys. The Caliph of Damascus. Reluctantly, the two leaders left Spain in September 714, never to return. Musa left his son Abdul al-Zir as governor. Whilst most of the peninsula had now been visited by Muslim armies, the conquest was by no means complete. The establishment of Muslim power seemed to have occurred in two stages. The first was to take over the main cities in the fertile lands of the south and the Levanten, in some cases with the assistance or at least agreements of members of the Visigoth nobility. This is a misconception. They say Visigoths in the Christians. It was actually the Byzantine Visigoths. They were a mixture. These were the nobles who had been slightly Visigothed from the Byzantine, because these were the Orthodox Christians. Because at this time period, under Visigoth rule, Byzantine Christianity made up more than 40% of the southern Spanish. And they got tired of the Catholicists constantly attacking them again and again and again, religiously speaking. Like the sons of Wits and Thermidor. The second phase involved the conquest of the northeast, where there is some evidence the Visigoth rule continued under Akhaled until the governorship of Al-Salim, and the making of peace agreements with the Visigoth lords, the Ebron Valley area, and other remote districts like the mountain north of Malgus. In this way, the conquest of Al-Andalus resembled, on a small scale, the Muslims conquered of Iran when the main cities and lines of communication were first secured, and only later with agreements reached with the inhabitants of the outlying areas. This is realistically because of the natural growth of how Muslim conquests went during these time periods. You come in, you take out the corrupt, and then you make negotiations with everyone else. And that's just the way it was. You didn't need to attack everything. And this is how Christianity survived for centuries. Some takes millennia in some parts of the world. There are still Christians in Iraq and Syria today, ladies and gentlemen, from these very same Muslim conquests that are arranged with original agreements. The reasons for these successive Muslim conquests have been much debated. From the Muslim side, the explanations were simple. God had willed it. For Christian communities, for the author of the 9th century chronicles of Al-Afral, again, not a fan of the chronicles, from the 3rd onwards, things were much more problematic, and they were faced with questions of how could God have allowed this disaster to affect a Christian people. For medieval authors, the most plausible explanation was that the Visigoths were immoral. Yes, they were. And they weren't supported by a great deal of Christianity and had disobeyed God's commandments, cannibalism. Whilst more secular modern historians have tended to look for signs of political decay and weakness in the Visigoth kingdoms. Again, the Visigoth kingdoms were not supported by the rest of Catholicism at the time. They had their own Catholic priests. There was a large section of them that was made up of Byzantium Orthodox. The Roman garrisons still existed in parts across the Visigoth kingdom. For the author of the Chronicles of 754, the blame lay with the ambitions of Rodriguez, the treachery of Oppa, son of King Ericus, who conspired with the Arabs, and the cowardice of the Archbishop of Toledo. He wasn't a coward. The Archbishop of Toledo was I can't even start to get that. Sinrad, who fled to Rome rather than remain with his flock. For the Chronicles of Aflon III, it was the immorality of King Witzrand. Again, the Chronicles are very, very biased, people. They have always been incredibly biased. They have always been Christocentric, and they have refused to hold a more moral capacity of history. Who, besides having many wives and concubines himself, ordered his bishops and deacons to marry, and the treachery of his sons that led to the Christian debacle. You see, this is an archbishop who had concubines, wives, when Christianity, even in this time period, said you can't get married. A lot of Christian archbishops and priests and that lot and landowners tended to anyway. In fact, the evidence for the decadence of the Visigoth kingdom is non-existent. There you go. In many ways, it seemed to have been strongly in its finer years than ever before. The damaged religious divisions between Arian Visigoths and the Orthodox subjects have been laid to rest for more than a century. This I disagree with entirely. This is where they're trying to discuss and hold up to the fact that there wasn't a disagreement. There was massive disagreements between the Visigoth Christians and the Visigoth Orthodox. And there is, by an end of the 7th century, no real sign of a split between the Romans and Visigoth elements. This is garbage. The Jews certainly suffered several legal disabilities. The Jews suffered heavily under Visigoth rule. Intermittent persecution, and it is clear that they preferred to remain in their cities and accept Muslim rule than to join their Christian fellow countrymen in flight. But there is no reliable evidence that they actively supported or encouraged the invaders. It is also true that the Basques remained outside effective Visigoth control, and indeed Rodrigo was campaigning in the area at the time of the first Muslim invasions, but separatism in the North Mountains had been a feature of political life for centuries, and it was no more dangerous or more threatening than before. In fact, in some ways, the very strength of the kingdom made it easier to conquer. If it had been divided into numerous local lordships and principalities, there would no doubt have been put to stiff resistance. As it was, Visigoth Spain, like Anglo-Saxon England in 1066, was centralised to the extent that the defeat of the royal army led to the entire land open to invaders. Yes and no. People continue to disregard the reality of the division between the Orthodox Christians and the Roman Catholic Christians. And again, this book is incredibly Christianicized. So again, we have to take this with a pinch of salt as it sits upon it. The Visigoth monarch suffered a short-term political crisis at the ascension of Rodrigo. Remember, he was a usurper. Resulting in the defection of important elements of the ruling class, which may in turn have contributed to a major military defeat. Yes, many of his more senior commanders and officers had already fucked off, and they were angry about it because of what happened. Resulting in the defection of the important elements of the ruling class, which may in turn have contributed to the major military defeat, which left the countries defenceless. The army had led against the invaders was certainly large enough for the purpose, its military worth less easy to assess. Again, we can't prove what weapons and armour the Visigoth people were using because of the traditions of the Barbians, and I'm not defending my brothers and sisters in their early periods of Christianity. They did rob the dead and bury them. That's just reality. Historically speaking, I'm not on about later ones, I'm on about the 7th century ones, because loot was your pay. Large enough for the purpose, its military was worth bad luck or bad decision making on the day rather than long-term military weakness. It is striking that there seems to have been little attempt to defend the cities effectively or to raise a second army, apart from resistance in the northern mountains, which was at the beginning not conducted by the Visigoths. Only Cordoba and Murder had put up any effective defence. The smallness of the numbers is noteworthy. Tarquin is said to have sent Murgar against Cordoba with only 300 men, which might not have been effective if the governor had been able to raise more than 400 to defend it. The city seemed to have been decrepit. The Roman bridges were broken and there were major holes in the ramparts. Whole sections of these ancient Roman cities had already fallen apart. And where everyone keeps defending, saying, oh, that's the Roman technology, the Roman medicine. No, the Roman era had already been sucked dry by the Visigoths and much of the Catholic period. You're already in the 7th century. Very little of these Roman cities have been modernised and updated. It would be the future Andalusicans who renovate these cities to their close to their pre-glory, Roman glory. It is striking that it seems to have been little attempt to defend the city where we Cordoba with only 300 men, which may not have been effective if the governor had been able to raise more men. The Roman bridges were broken. When the Muslims arrived at Aureliaria, the governor Thermidor had so few men that he had to dress up women as soldiers and put them on the ramparts. No one seemed to have defended Toledo, a superb natural fortress. Perhaps this failure was partly a result of the lack of population. I don't necessarily agree with that lack of population thing, because Iberia, Spain at that point still had nearly 3 to 4 million people. I think it was genuine, my opinion, I think it was genuinely the hatred of the Visigoth royal families. The Visigoth nobility were deeply, deeply despised. Much of the oral history and much of the liturgical history of the Rodrigan nobility from both Christianity and Islam says how much they were disliked by both the Byzantine peasantry and the ex-Roman legionnaires. Theodore had a few men rampant. No one seemed to have defended Toledo, a superior natural fortress. Perhaps this failure was partly a result of lack of population, or at least of arm-bearing population. When Saladin invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187, the Crusaders mustered a large army to oppose him, but to do so they had to empty their cities and fortifications of men. When they lost the battle at Hattin, they splendid castles were left virtually undefended, and most of them soon fell to the invaders. This may well have been the same in the case of the Visigoth Spains. It was not perhaps the numbers of the population in general were lacking, but rather the numbers of military men were inadequate. That's correct. The king of Visigoth didn't recruit enough men. This is a critical point of view. He spent more time debating, politicking, fighting with his own nobles. When there were men who could have been trained and armed, they weren't, because the king was using money to squabble and disagree with his nobles. So, with that, I think we will leave that 20-minute gap where we are. I mean, I hope you enjoy what I'm doing. I am going to be building a Patreon, hoping for some support from the people who watch my videos, especially my Andalusian ones. And I hope you find my annotations attached to this useful and informative. hope I'm actually putting my history degree to some good use. Alhamdulillah, it's been a pleasure talking to you all. Speak to you soon. Mashallah.